Back in 2021, I took an organic acids test to see what my oxalate levels were. Now, 5 years later, let's see how that's changed. An organic acids test is usually a urine sample that focuses on picking out certain acid compounds in your body that are related to health markers. So things that come up are like citric acid, malic acid, and things that you've heard of, and there's a lot of things that you probably haven't heard of. And one of those acids is, of course, oxalic acid or oxalates. So in general, an oxalate is just some sort of derivative of oxalic acid, and this is typically the thing that we see a lot in kidney stones and people who have hyperoxaluria. So I have my own story that I haven't gotten into yet where I got hyperoxaluria. Funny enough, it came from eating a bunch of spinach, but really if you know a lot about oxalates, that's not that surprising. So I started having a ton of health issues and I wasn't sure what the problem was. I started doing research into what happens when you eat too much spinach, and eventually I found out that eating too much spinach can expose you to a bunch of oxalates. Spinach is the highest food out there in oxalates. It's followed by almonds and then chocolate, and then there's a lot of other foods that are higher in oxalates. But having just eaten a bunch of spinach in Scotland as well, I was in a study abroad program. I ended up being admitted to the hospital because of how bad it was, and the security guard at the time told me that I'm not Popeye, so why am I eating so much spinach? You're not Popeye, is what he said to me. And at the time, nobody could help me figure out what was going on. So after doing research, looking into oxalates, seeing that it was causing a lot of the same issues that I was feeling, having pain and just these like flashes of exhaustion and confusion, and it was causing weird mental issues as well, I found that there was a lot of people, a huge community of people who have been affected by oxalates. So it's quite common, and so I ran a test on myself to find out if I had high oxalates. So I took an organic acids test. It tests a lot of other things, but it includes oxalates and oxalic acid. That will show up in the oxalate metabolites because there's three key components that are related to oxalates. They have a sort of a life cycle inside the body, but I ended up finding that my oxalate levels were pretty normal. They were well within the normal region. They weren't super high, and one of the things that I ran into at this time was that I kept having cloudy pee. So quite frequently when I would urinate, it would be cloudy. And it was almost like there were like particles inside of it. So I thought, of course, this would be the oxalates. And the problem is, I didn't have this realization until after I sent in my sample. Well, after I sent in my sample, I realized I sent in a pretty normal sample. It wasn't very cloudy at all. And I was kicking myself for years because that's why the oxalates didn't show up, was because I sent in a not cloudy sample. Of course, you have to send in a cloudy sample if you want to see what the cloudy stuff is. And so oxalates didn't show up. Now, there's a lot of other results in here too that I want to compare because I've gotten a lot healthier over the years. I've gone gluten-free. I've figured out my nut allergies, all sorts of other things, and I want to see what other differences we can find between these two samples. But the biggest thing was the oxalates. 5 years later, I start having oxalate issues again, and this time it came from eating raw mushrooms. So that's a whole nother thing that I'll have to get into at some point, but apparently they're high in oxalates. I didn't know that. So I had eaten maybe a container, maybe two over the course of a week or two. Because again, there's not many foods that I can eat nowadays. So when I find something, I do eat a lot of it. And just like the spinach, I was making spinach smoothies back in Scotland. I consumed so much that I was having hyperoxaluria. So I figured this was a great time to finally go in and redo my test. So I sent in a very, very cloudy sample, and I was like, this is it. We're gonna catch the oxalates. It's definitely high oxalic acid. We got it. And so looking at our oxalate metabolites, you'll see my oxalic acid is normal. It fell in the exact same normal region. It's well within the mole density. It is very typical, very normal, well within standard quartiles. Okay, so that's interesting. First off, so the cloudy sample did not include oxalates, even though I know that I had eaten a lot of oxalates beforehand. Okay, so that's really important because oxalates are water soluble, so they can kind of go in and out, and they're not always particulate. They're not always in particle form. But I noticed very high levels of this particular oxalate metabolite. Now, this one is off the charts. It's so far off. I mean, it's past the bar chart. It's so far off. And it's the only one that's far off. Like, even all of these other oxalate metabolites and kind of throughout the rest of my results, not many of them are far off. So what is this? Glycolic acid, or otherwise known as glycolates. Now, I did a lot of research into what the heck this is, and it actually didn't make a lot of sense at first. But let's go back and see what my glycolates look like on the other charts. So, sure enough, on my other test results, the glycolic acid was also on the higher end. So, oxalates, not very much. The other one, not very much, but glycolic acid. So, what is glycolic acid? Well, if you go to Wikipedia and if you go to look up things in general on glycolic acid, you'll find basically nothing. I mean, like, the basic description is it occurs in all green plants. So it's some sort of organic acid compound that occurs in green plants. So the first thing that I want to note is that hyperoxaluria doesn't always appear as high oxalic acids on tests. So if you do an oxalic acid test and you don't show up positive, you can still have high oxalate exposure. It will just present as glycolic acid. Okay, so that's your first marker. So if you have high glycolic acid, and in general, any of the oxalate metabolites that are higher than normal, that is a sign of hyperoxaluria. Now here's why. There is essentially an oxalate life cycle in the body. Oxalates are a normal organic acid that is produced by the body throughout just normal metabolic processes. And in fact, just by the way, having high levels of citric acid can actually end up converting into oxalates at some point. So there's these kind of intermediary acids that can convert into glyoxalate, which then eventually converts into oxalic acid. Now, glyoxalate can also turn into glycolate. And this graph doesn't actually show that fully. So there's almost like a 3-part cycle between oxalates, glyoxalate, and glycolates. And they can sort of convert into each other. So what can end up happening in the body is that you have high oxalate exposure and your body knows that oxalates are bad for your body. So it will convert those into a different organic acid like glyoxalate or glycolate. That way it can kind of balance out the body, and oxalic acid we can get rid of through the kidneys by filtering it out, and there's other methods of getting rid of oxalates. Glycolate, on the other hand, is not as easily disposed of in the body. Now there is a way to get rid of it, but it's very possible that you can have high oxalate exposure and then it converts into the other two, glyoxalate and glycolate, and then they all sort of balance out, and then we get rid of the oxalates, but we still have high levels of glycolate. So these are organic acids that sort of like switch around. They can convert into other organic acids, and one of those that is really hard to get rid of is glycolic acid. So you can eat a bunch of oxalates, it converts into glycolate, you get rid of the oxalic acid, and then you still have high levels of glycolate. So eventually over time it will convert back into oxalates. You'll kind of slowly get rid of the glycolate and stuff. So eventually I went back to normal after like a couple of weeks, but it does take time. However, I ended up noticing a very peculiar thing with glycolates, because my biggest question then was, how do we get rid of this? Because clearly having high levels of oxalates, our body does have a way of getting rid of it through binding with minerals like calcium, magnesium, sodium, even iron, and that will create these calcium salts, which is how you get calcium oxalate, and then that's what becomes kidney stones and things. So there are ways of crystallizing and getting rid of oxalates, but what about glycolates? Well, what we find is that specifically vitamin B6 plays a role in reducing hyperoxaluria. So I found a couple studies, and by a couple, I mean literally 2 studies who even talk about this at all, where they found that when they administered vitamin B6 to patients with hyperoxaluria, it reduced the level of oxalates. Now, why? What we find is that the body's primary method of getting rid of glycolate involves vitamin B6. So in other words, if you're deficient in vitamin B6, you're not going to be able to get rid of glycolates. And on one hand, yes, you should be able to eat a lot of food and get your vitamins, and that's what everyone says, but also sometimes that's just not realistic. Sometimes you get exposed to so much oxalates, so many glycolates, that your body will not be able to get rid of it because the vitamin B6 in your body is just not sufficient to deal with it, and you have to take a supplement. So what I have found then is taking vitamin B6 as a form of preventing or getting rid of hyperoxaluria works. And so essentially, you eat something like spinach, you get high levels of oxalates, your body converts that over into glycolates. And then as it's getting rid of oxalates, we still have these high levels of glycolate that we have to get rid of. It will slowly convert back into oxalates over time, but to speed up the process of getting rid of those glycolates, we can actually take vitamin B6 and it will directly help the body metabolize glycolate. So that's what these studies found, was that by taking vitamin B6, you can literally treat high oxalate levels or hyperoxaluria. There's also a disease where you just have an inability to process oxalates normally in your body, and they found that vitamin B6 is a way of treating, it's called primary hyperoxaluria. So we should note though that taking a lot of vitamin B6 can be actually dangerous. A lot of the B vitamins like B12 aren't, and you can take a lot of them, but vitamin B6 can cause neurotoxicity things, and so we do have to be careful about that. Granted, even in these supplement forms, it is still technically difficult for your body to absorb all 100 milligrams of the vitamin B6, but to give you a number, the studies have found that no more than 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight are effective. So taking up to that amount is effective. So for instance, I am around 60 kilos. So if we're to go 5 milligrams per 60 kilograms, I could take upwards of 300 milligrams of vitamin B6 per day long term. And they say that they are suggesting as a maximum of that amount and no more than that. So I, for instance, at this time have been taking around 10 to 20 milligrams per day as just sort of a normal supplement, but it is important to just keep that in mind. So the level is quite high that you could take, but some things that can happen from that is like some nerve damage even as well, and it can cause like tingling or burning sensations in your hands and feet and stuff, so don't go crazy with it. But if you have a deficiency in vitamin B6, it is quite possible that your hyperoxaluria doesn't present as high oxalates. It instead presents as high glycolate. So I'm going to run through some of the other test results that I got just because they're interesting. So I have my new results here on the left side and then my old results on the right side, and we're just going to go through one by one. So like we had before, I actually had higher glycolate in my previous test results, which is interesting. Everything else is pretty much the same. Lactic acid. And remember, the whole point of this was that I gave them a cloudy sample as the new sample, and I didn't do that last time. So what is in the cloudy sample that wasn't in the old sample? Because I also had hyperoxaluria during both of these events. So the only difference is the high cloudy content. Succinic acid. I actually don't know what a lot of these are, but that one is on the higher end. It's much higher than it was before, so that's interesting. And then my citric acid, actually. This actually isn't measuring literally your citric acid. It's measuring other markers that indicate that you might have a deficiency in citric acid. So they explain more of this in the test, but that is interesting. So technically I've been trying to drink a lot of orange juice now. because of that. And I think it's been helping. Okay, my mitochondrial markers seem to be fine. These are markers associated with neurotransmitters, and they're roughly equal to what I had beforehand. Nothing super crazy there. They do give you a pretty in-depth life cycle of how a lot of these markers come about and why they're measuring them. So you can see that serotonin, high levels of serotonin, are related to like vitamin B6 and other things, and it gets converted into this chemical here. Okay, so then folate, my folate levels look pretty normal. Then they have ketones and fatty acids. All of that seems pretty normal except this one here at the end. But otherwise, it's pretty typical to what I've had before. Okay, and then the interesting one, obviously, is the nutritional markers. Oh, and this is interesting. Wait a minute. If I look at my vitamin B6, it actually is on the lower end. Now, that's interesting. What does that mean? Okay, so there's a couple of them that are inverses. So if you have a high level of like this, for instance, it means you have a deficiency. Everything else, though, if it's low, it means you have a deficiency. So for instance, vitamin C here, I was 0. So I have no vitamin C. Technically, my vitamin B6 is really, really low. So that actually works with our theory here that vitamin B6 is necessary in getting rid of glycolates. That's really interesting. And also you can see that the vitamin B6 here is higher beforehand. So that's super interesting. So literally I was deficient in vitamin B6 and that's why I had hyperoxaluria. That's so interesting. We got some other stuff. This one, I'm probably deficient in vitamin B2, and then everything else is pretty normal. Okay, and then ammonia excess is really interesting. That is much higher, and again, I'm not really sure why, but again, I was just going through it. I had all sorts of, I was feeling really terrible, so seeing that these are a lot higher than it was on the previous tests, really interesting. So ammonia, did not expect that. Interesting. Okay, amino acids, so, you know, some protein stuff, basically pretty typical to what I had beforehand. They haven't labeled anything as suspect, so I'm gonna assume that this is pretty normal. If anything, I'm a little bit higher on everything than I was before, I think. Okay, and then we have phosphoric acid, and I am very low on that. So again, maybe I need some more phosphorus. I don't know. Okay, and that's about it. So one of the only other things that I've seen on here about glycolates is that they say something about it has to do with toxic exposure. So maybe if you've been exposed somehow to like bacteria and fungus and toxicants and stuff, ethylene, glycol, antifreeze, you can have high levels of glycolate. Obviously, we know that that didn't happen to me. It came purely from having high oxalate exposure, and mushrooms being a fungus that's not what's happening either. Not that kind of fungus. But again, they do mention, I actually didn't see this until now, they do mention a reduced level of vitamin B6 can be correlated with high glycolate levels. So basically the whole point of this test was I was trying to figure out, why do I have high levels of oxalate? How can I measure the high levels of oxalate? Because I tried before and oxalate didn't come up. Well, this time glycolate came up. And that makes sense because there's a correlation between glycolate converting into oxalates, and then if you are deficient in vitamin B6, you can't get rid of the glycolates. So I just wanted to put this out there because I did this test. I paid, hundreds of dollars to have these tests done because I was trying to get to the bottom of this. And if you've ever struggled with this, I hope this can help, because I was so confused why when I took my other test, I didn't have high levels of oxalates. Well, this is the reason why it might show up as glycolates instead. At which case, then you're in luck because you can just take vitamin B6 and it'll go away. I also have noticed that after taking vitamin B6 pretty regularly, I feel like I can eat higher oxalate foods like potatoes, for instance, potato chips, things like that. I used to have an issue with, and I love potatoes. Potatoes are great. So that's pretty nice that I'm able to do things like that. So I just wanted to put this video out out there because I have struggled with figuring out why glycolate would even show up. Like, there's not a lot of content talking about what is glycolate, where does it come from, because a lot of resources that I found were like, oh yeah, it's impossible to have high glycolate. High glycolate never happens. You can't get that. And it took so much digging to even figure out that there was any metabolic process converting oxalates into glycolates and stuff. And it's this whole like circle of like converting everything. So super confusing. But now you know that oxalates can convert into glycolate, and then you can that can stick around for a long time if you're deficient in vitamin B6, and then you have cloud EP and you don't know why, and it's not showing up as high oxalates. I figured I'd go through and just kind of show you some higher oxalate foods, just because these are things that you might be struggling with if you have hyperoxaluria. So again, like I've said, chocolate is on the higher end. Cocoa powder, cocoa is the highest, one of the highest. It literally goes spinach, almonds, and then cocoa, I think. Most of this stuff is pretty typical. Miso soup, it's not very high in oxalates. Most fruits, pineapple, figs, prunes, raspberries, all of this stuff is super benign, does not have that many oxalates. You start getting into the grains though, rice, buckwheat, wheat, grits, that starts to get in the higher level of oxalates, because oxalates are a plant byproduct, and it attacks calcium, which is why you don't want it in your body, because we're made out of bones. But you can see right here, they put cocoa powder way down here with 67 milligrams. That's because they only have 4 teaspoons of cocoa powder versus 1 cup. So 1 cup is 48 teaspoons. Holy moly, that is a lot. And so if we take our 4 teaspoons here, that means that we have 12 times the amount that they say here. So if you have a full cup of cocoa powder in comparison to all this other stuff, we take 12 times 67, 804 milligrams of oxalate content. The highest thing on here is rice bran with like maybe 300. Then we're talking like cornmeal, millet, whatever, 30, 60, maybe 100 milligrams here and there. Cocoa powder comes in at 800 milligrams per cup. Compared to all of this stuff, it's off the charts. So that's why I've been saying cocoa powder is one of the highest oxalate foods out there, save for spinach. And then we get into like white rice flour, this stuff, like basically no oxalates. So, yeah, they're just going through a whole bunch of like normal foods and stuff, basically no oxalates. And then we get into the nuts, and nuts have a lot of oxalates in them, especially almonds. So almonds are like 3 to 4 times as high as every other nut. Cashews, mixed nuts, peanuts, trail mix, pistachios, pecans, tree nuts in general, not as much as almonds. Nothing beats almonds. So it really is, I'm telling you, it's spinach, cocoa, and almonds. And also 1 ounce is not very much of almonds. Looks like 1 cup of almonds is about 5 ounces. So that means 1 cup of almonds puts this at, instead of 1 ounce, 5 ounces, which makes this 600 milligrams of oxalates. Not to mention, if you get almond flour, that's even more condensed, and you can put more ounces into a cup. So 1 cup of almond flour could even have upwards of 1,000 milligrams of oxalates. Which, by the way, I ate almond bread back in January and had the worst reaction to it. I didn't do it on purpose. It happened by accident. I got poisoned. But again, the amount of oxalates that I got exposed to alone is off the charts. So again, this is kind of misleading in my opinion, the way that they're doing all this, because now we're back to 1 cup. But okay, this is where everything comes down. Spinach. And this is cooked spinach. So, okay, Popeye spinach, little can of Popeye spinach, 1,500 milligrams. So over 1,000 milligrams of oxalates. Rhubarb, 1,000. Okra, 1,000. Spinach raw, closer to 700. Then we finally get into like more-ish normal things. Beet greens, I don't even know who eats that. Then we have Swiss chard, beets, and then we're finally into like the normal category of like 100-ish milligrams. So that like, nobody eats this stuff, you know. Like, don't eat Swiss chard, don't eat spinach. Beets, beans, rutabaga, you know, that's normal stuff. Everything up here is 10 times the amount that's in beets. Literally, like, spinach is 10 times the amount of oxalates that you would get from beets. Potatoes are a little on the higher end. They're like around 100. But then again, this is saying that a cup of sweet potatoes is still only 28 milligrams. So if you are suspicious that you've eaten a bunch of spinach, maybe rhubarb pie, maybe you've been chowing down on beet greens for some reason, you might show up as high glycolate instead of high oxalates. And if you do, take some vitamin B6, but I hope this helps explain why you might have high levels of glycolate and not oxalic acid. So hopefully this video helped. I have a lot of stuff to go through. I've been working so much on doing research into my food allergies. So if this is helpful at all, please let me know. Let me know if there's other food allergies you want me to cover. I've got a lot to go through. So please subscribe, stick around, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.